living in Nigeria, how well do you know the law in Nigeria? Not in a vague or general sense. Not saying, oh, I know you shouldn't steal things or I know you should not kill someone. I mean, how well do you know the actual written law? The specific provisions in the law? How well do you know things that are technically illegal, technically your rights, or technically the government's obligation to provide for you? Now, most Nigerians have never read and will not actually believe some of the things that are in the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. And I spent time this week reading the 1999 Constitution and the Criminal Code Act. And what I want to tell you is that there are things in these documents that surprised me. Some of them are actually funny and some of them are genuinely very important. And some of them are also the two of these things simultaneously. But one thing is very certain. It is very helpful to know these things given Nigeria's current security situation. So today we are going through some of these surprising, strange, and equally important laws. And then we hope that by the end of this episode, you can actually learn stuff that actually changes how you interact with authority the next time you find yourself in a difficult situation. I am Angelo, and this is the Clarity Podcast. Let us get right into it. Let us start with the Criminal Code Act, which is a document that defines most criminal offenses in Nigeria. And to be clear, this document is different from the Constitution. The Constitution is the supreme law, while the Criminal Code is the law that criminalizes specific behaviors. Now, both of these are enforced, and the laws I'm about to tell you now come directly from the Criminal Code text. Now, the first one, and one of the laws that I found really funny and unreasonable, comes from Section 327 of the Criminal Code Act. And to quote it, it says, "Any person who attempts to kill himself is guilty of a misdemeanor and is liable to imprisonment for 1 year." Now, this says that if you attempt suicide in Nigeria and survive, you have committed a crime. And in this case, a misdemeanor that carries a possible prison sentence of 1 year. Now, there's no way to frame this that makes it sound reasonable. A person is going through the worst moment of their life and they attempt suicide and eventually survive, only to come and face prosecution. And this provision has been widely criticized by mental health advocates and legal reformers across Nigeria for years. And some states have even moved to decriminalize attempted suicide. But so far they have been unsuccessful and the law still remains. Now, a second law that I found really interesting is claiming to be a witch is a criminal offense. So, according to Section 210 of the Criminal Code Act, any person who, by his statements or action, represents himself to be a witch or to have the power of witchcraft is guilty of a misdemeanor and is liable to imprisonment for 2 years. So, this law works in two directions. You cannot claim to be a witch, and you can also not accuse someone else of being a witch. That too is an offense under this section. And then a separate section, Section 424, says that any person who, for gain or reward, pretends to exercise or use any kind of witchcraft, juju, sorcery, enchantment, or conjuration, or undertakes to tell fortunes is guilty of a misdemeanor and liable to imprisonment for 1 year. So anybody that takes your money and claims to be prophesying about your future is actually committing a crime. Now, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not saying that anyone has been prosecuted for such crimes recently, but I'm just saying this law actually exists. Now, another interesting law in the Criminal Code Act is that offering a reward for lost property without asking questions is illegal. Now, Section 129 of the Criminal Code Act says that it is a criminal offense to publicly offer a reward for the return of lost or stolen property, and in the offer, you make use of words that say that you're not going to ask questions of the person that returns the property. Now, the phrase "no questions asked" is the problem that this law is trying to battle, because the logic of the law is that publicly assuring a thief or a criminal that they will not face consequences for returning stolen property is facilitating crime. This is a law in Nigeria. Now, another very interesting law is that husband and wife of a Christian marriage cannot conspire against each other. Now, Section 34 of the Criminal Code Act says that a husband and wife of Christian marriage are not criminally responsible for a conspiracy between themselves alone. So, in other words, if a husband and wife of a Christian marriage hatch a criminal plan together, just the two of them, and they involve no other third party, that plan cannot constitute criminal conspiracy under this section. Now, the principle behind this law is that a husband and wife in Christian marriage were historically considered one legal person. Now, whether this provision of the law still has practical application in modern Nigerian courts is a question for lawyers, but the truth is that this law is still in the Nigerian Criminal Code Act. Now, another law also, which is quite interesting, is that a woman of a Christian marriage has a specific legal defense. And this is according to Section 33 of the Criminal Code Act, which states that a married woman is not automatically free from criminal responsibility simply because her husband is present. But, and this is the interesting part of this law, a wife of a Christian marriage is not criminally responsible for doing or omitting to do an act which she is actually compelled to do by her husband, or to do or omit to do which is done or omitted to be done in his presence, except in the case of an act or omission which would constitute an offence punishable by death. Now, let me just break down this technical jargon. If a wife of a Christian marriage is physically compelled by her husband to commit a crime in his presence, she has a legal defense under this section. Although this section is subject to exemptions, like if the crime is an offence punishable by death or if it involves grievous harm. Also notice that this law states that this law is specific for Christian marriages, not all marriages. Now, those were some of the laws that I found to be somewhat funny and somewhat unreasonable in the Criminal Code Act. Now, we'll move on to the laws that can be found in the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, because in there contains provisions that most Nigerians may have never read or heard of. And you have things like the rights that are guaranteed to citizens, obligations the government owe to the citizens, and also limitations on what the law can actually do to the government. Now, these make a real difference in real life situations. The first one is, if you are arrested unlawfully, you are entitled to compensation and a public apology. Now, Chapter 4 of the 1999 Constitution, which deals with fundamental human rights, contains a provision that most Nigerians have never heard of. In Section 35, subsection 6, it states that any person who is unlawfully arrested or detained shall be entitled to compensation and public apology from the appropriate authority or person. Now, any authority or individual, like a police officer who arrests you without legal justification, and you are able to successfully challenge that arrest, the Constitution states that you are owed both money and an official apology by that person. And whether this provision is consistently applied in practice is a different conversation entirely, because these days you even see people who are unlawfully arrested giving apologies to the person who arrested them. Our second law is that you actually have the right to remain silent. In Section 35, subsection 2 of the Constitution, it states that any person who is arrested or detained shall have the right to remain silent or avoid answering any question until consultations with a legal practitioner or any other person of his choice has been done. Now, this right exists in Nigerian Constitution, not just in American movies. So the next time that you are in a meet and greet with a Nigerian police officer who tells you that you must answer questions immediately, know that the person is actually working against the supreme law of the country. Now, a third law, which I'm sure is not very popular, is you must be told why you are being arrested and in writing within 24 hours. In Section 35, subsection 3 of the Constitution, any person who is arrested or detained shall be informed in writing within 24 hours and in a language that he or she understands of the facts and grounds of his arrest or detention. So this law makes it a constitutional requirement that anybody who is arrested must be told within 24 hours in a language they understand, in writing. These are the specifics of this particular law. And as always, whether it is being enforced in practical situations is another conversation entirely. So another law is that you cannot be tried for something that was not a crime when you did it. So in Section 36, subsection 8 of the Constitution, no person shall be held to be guilty of a criminal offence on account of any acts or omission that they did not, at the time it took place, constitute as an offence. So this basically says that the government cannot retroactively criminalize behavior. If something was legal when you did it, making it illegal afterwards does not make you a criminal for the earlier acts. Now, a law also that is in the Constitution, and it has been a topic of discourse in Nigerian circles in recent weeks, is your phone calls and private correspondence are constitutionally protected. And this is clearly stated in Section 37 of the Constitution. The privacy of citizens, their homes, their correspondence, their telephone conversations, their telegraphic communications is hereby guaranteed and protected. Although the Constitution also allows restrictions on these rights for specific legitimate purposes like national security, public order, and so on. So these are not absolute rights, but the baseline in the Constitution is constitutional protection, and any government action that breaches this privacy without lawful authority is acting against the Constitution. Now, another law to know is that every Nigerian has the right to own property anywhere in Nigeria. And this is stated in Section 43 of the Constitution, which says, subject to the provisions of the Constitution, every citizen of Nigeria shall have the right to acquire and own immovable property anywhere in Nigeria. So, if you're a citizen of Nigeria, no matter your state of origin, you can own property in any place in Nigeria. So people saying that someone from another state cannot own property in their state are actually acting against the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Now, I want to tell you about the most important and least discussed aspect of the Nigerian Constitution. And it requires a short explanation of how the Constitution is structured. So Chapter 4 of the Constitution, which just went through some of the laws in there, contains what are called fundamental rights. And these are enforceable, in that you can go to court and sue if they are violated. So if a police officer unlawfully arrests you, Section 35 gives you a legal remedy. If your privacy is breached by the state without authority, Section 37 gives you standing to challenge it. So the rights in Chapter 4 are justiciable, which is the legal term for you can take it to court. But Chapter 2 of the Constitution is different. Chapter 2 is titled Fundamental Objectives and Directive Principles of State Policy, and it contains what sounds like an extraordinary list of commitments the Nigerian state has made to its citizens. Chapter 2 says the state shall direct its policy towards ensuring that citizens have the opportunity for adequate means of livelihood, that there are adequate medical and health facilities for all persons, that there is equal pay for equal work, that government shall provide free, compulsory and universal primary education, free secondary education, and university education. Chapter 2 also promises Nigerians healthcare, education, and a livable wage. And then the Constitution goes ahead to say in Section 6, subsection 6, paragraph C, that the judicial powers of the courts shall not extend to any issue or question as to whether any act or omission by any authority or person, or as to whether any law or any judicial decision is in conformity with the fundamental objectives and directive principles of state policy set out in Chapter 2 of the Constitution. So, in plain language, what this means is that you cannot take the government to court for failing to provide what Chapter 2 promised you. So, Chapter 2 is not legally enforceable. The promises of healthcare, education, and livelihood are all just aspirational principles. The Constitution calls them directive principles, meaning that they are just meant to guide government policy and not create any legal obligations to courts so they can be enforced. A Nigerian citizen cannot sue the federal government for failing to provide free secondary education, even though the Constitution says that the government shall provide it. Now, most Nigerians have never heard of this distinction, and I'm sure if you're just learning this for the first time, it will change how you read government commitments, how you evaluate political promises, and how you understand the actual legal architecture of the country you live in. It will also open your eyes to the reality of the current Nigerian state, which is very, very sad, because it seems like our leaders took the fact that citizens cannot challenge them to court seriously and are failing to deliver on most of the promises that the Constitution have made. And so finally, in this episode, we talked about laws from the Criminal Code Act, funny laws like the fact that when you attempt suicide and you survive, you are technically a criminal. And also the fact that claiming to be a witch or accusing someone of witchcraft is an offence. And also offering a reward for lost property with the words "no questions asked" is also an offence. And then we moved on to the Constitution, where we talked about laws like if you are unlawfully arrested, you are constitutionally entitled to compensation and a public apology. We spoke about how your phone calls and correspondence are constitutionally protected under Section 37 of the Constitution. And then we spoke about the most important structural point, which is the fact that the rights in Chapter 4 are enforceable in courts, and the Chapter 2 promises healthcare, education, livelihood are simply directive principles that courts cannot actually enforce, regardless of how clearly they are stated in the Constitution. And so, knowing your rights is not enough. You have to actually know which of these rights you can actually exercise. I hope this distinction has given you some clarity. This has been the Clarity Podcast. I am Angelo, and if this episode has taught you something about the law of Nigeria that you did not know, please share it to someone else. The Constitution belongs to every Nigeria, and everyone should know their rights. Thank you for listening. Follow us on all our socials, and you can send topic suggestions to our email. The handle is in the description of the episode. See you next week, and until then, think clearly.